Hello, Websphere. Welcome to the Psychedelic Spirituality podcast. My name is Buckley Rue. I am an admin at Psychedelic Spirituality. I have a bachelor's in religious studies and psychology from the University of Texas at Austin. And I am joined, as always, by my partner, Alexander Ward, who is a visionary artist of the highest degree. He has a very successful coloring book that has been out, that has even been supported by Graham Hancock, and he has done a number of documentary work on ayahuasca and DMT. Say hi, Alex.
Hi, good to be here and good to talk to you both again.
And today I am joined by Peter Shustet H., a psychedelic philosopher of, I believe, one of the highest grades. He is a teacher at Exeter University in England, and he is author of the book Numismatics, Metaphysics, and Metaethics and Psychedelics. Welcome with us, Peter.
Thank you, Berkeley. Alex, pleasure.
Peter, so you, to begin with, one of my favorite things about you is that you have pulled no punches about being a sort of philosopher of psychedelics, a philosopher of altered consciousness. What is it that draws you into psychedelics? What has been, I guess, sort of the nature of your relationship with psychedelics that have fueled your interest in philosophy?
Well, I started with philosophy first.
All right.
But it's a symbiotic relationship because through philosophy, especially the philosophy of mind and aspects of the philosophy of religion, I became interested in psychedelics, especially through William James, who took nitrous oxide, ether, and so on, and related it to mystical states over 100 years ago. And through him mostly, but also a few other reasons, I decided to experiment with what was first psilocybin mushrooms. And it just, it was just such a sort of a shock to the system. I really had no idea how incredible these experiences would be. So I'm sure a lot of your listeners will know that already. But as a result of that, I thought, right, okay, God, how do I classify this? How do I sort of think about, how do I conceptualize what just happened to me? So I looked at the literature in philosophy of mind, or metaphysics, which I think, goes to the heart, the crux of reality. I mean, that's what it's supposed to do, at least, beyond physics, beyond psychology. Anyway, so I thought I should look at the most amazing, the most phenomenal kind of experience one can have through the deepest kind of literature that is there. But when I looked, there was not much, really. There was not much metaphysics and not much philosophy of mind on psychedelic experiences, really. So that in itself, I thought, was a pity. I mean, there's obviously political reasons, at least for the latter 20th century. But so anyway, I read, I think, just about all the literature there was on it, and then I thought I'd try to start the conversation a bit more. So I wrote Numismatics and sort of conveyed my experiences and how it relates to certain philosophies and what is unknown, in other words, most of it. And what I've been doing recently, what I've sort of accidentally found myself doing, is analyzing psychedelic experiences through different philosophies, through Whitehead, through Bergson, through Schopenhauer. I'm beginning to look at it through Spinoza in relation to Humphrey Davy, and others. So yeah. So
and which one of those philosophies best helps describe some of the psychedelic states?
Personally, I think Whitehead's philosophy, Alfred North Whitehead, who died in 1947. Whitehead was an English philosopher who inaugurated what is known as process philosophy, a very powerful, influential philosophy, also process theology. And yeah, I've written 2 essays on his relationship to psychedelic experience, not his personal relationship. I don't, to my knowledge, he didn't take anything, but
yeah.
he himself was a big admirer of William James, who wrote about these things, and inspired by Bergson as well, who inspired Aldous Huxley. So there is the connection there. He also talks about mystical states, and he's very much interested in time. He's written essays about time in dreams and how it's distinct from time in non-dreams, as it were, and that the relationship between dream time and Einstein's theories of relativity. So there's a lot to extract from Whitehead. After I wrote about it, I discovered Lenny Gibson had written about it as well. In fact, he's written a really good new essay about it that sent me recently, but also a Cornish philosopher, or at least a philosopher who lived in Cornwall called Colin Wilson, I realized later had written about the relationship, mildly as well. Colin Wilson, he's known as the English existentialist. He wrote, he wrote The Outsider, not Camus' Outsider, but his own, and became a sort of famous name because of that in the mid-20th century. But then he sort of lost a lot of his credibility after that by writing about UFOs and whatnot. But nonetheless, he wrote about it. So Whitehead, I think, is the main, is the greatest.
Yes. I've already had two people mention his work before. What Is You, and another is incredible psychedelic, something about very intellectual people interested in psychedelics. Whitehead's work really sort of speaks to them.
I think so, yeah. And there's going to be a seminar in California I'm going to in March, actually, related to this. So I'm looking forward to that. But we're only at the tip of the iceberg here. There's so much to uncover. There's something else as well. I mean, Whitehead said in a way he was a Spinozist, and Spinoza's philosophy also lends itself to interpretation, especially with regard to something Spinoza calls the intellectual love of God, which is a sort of intuition of pure reality, which for him was a monism, a unity which was beyond matter and beyond mind even. So basically, as I'm saying, I'm just going through now the sort of motions of these interpretations, but thus far, hitherto, Whitehead has been the most fruitful in this regard.
That's really interesting. And starting to become acquainted with your work, one of the things I found really interesting was that the tradition of being a psychonaut seems to go back a lot further than we seem to take it granted for. I've noticed you posting links about Nietzsche's work, experience with altered consciousness, even getting into somewhat pseudo psychedelic states, it seemed like.
Yeah.
And your work with Humphrey Davy, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I've just finished an essay and gave 2 talks about Humphrey Davy's relationship to what we now call psychedelics. I mean, I call him the first scientific psychonaut. He wrote about nitrous oxide in the year 1800, published a book on it, and that included subjective effects. And very interesting, in his notebooks, he linked nitrous oxide experiences to idealism, which is the philosophy that matter is not real. Mind is fundamentally real, and matter is a projection of mind. So from the very start, of Western psychedelia, as it were. I mean, the word psychedelic, of course, came from the 1950s from Humphrey Osmond. But nonetheless, we're talking about psychedelic experiences, call it what you will. And the very first methodological scientific approach to that brought Davy to idealism. He was also friends with Wordsworth and Coleridge, who were very much influenced by Spinoza and other idealists like Kant, Schopenhauer, Schelling, and so on.
It definitely seems like there seems to be almost sort of like a universal sort of revelatory process involved in this whole bit, because when people are in the midst of psychedelia, in the midst of a revelatory experience, nobody really ever seems to come to the conclusion that materialism is the ultimate reality.
I've never come across a person who was an idealist who became a materialist after taking LSD. You're absolutely right. It's very, very unusual. And it is very telling, I think, that at the very first stages of chemical mysticism, as we can call it, in the West, that philosophical link was made immediately. But then it went quiet. And we have to wait really almost 100 years later for William James to come out and write about it again, with some people in the middle, but no one is known as, it was Humphrey Davy was knighted, the only scientist after Newton to be knighted, and he was president of the Royal Society, lecturer at the Royal Institution, discovered barium, magnesium, calcium, and so on. So, no one really noteworthy and someone able to publish books had written much about this. But before Davy, there was Robert Hooke and Robert Boyle, who had experimented with cannabis as well, but not to the methodological extent of Davy. So it's interesting. So the very start of this experimentation brings people to philosophy, certain metaphysics, idealism, Spinozism. I should say Davy, after his poem about nitrous oxide in his notebooks, writes a poem called The Spinozist. And that's what I explore in my new essay. But anyway, it's interesting that these first experimenters connected their experiences to deep metaphysics, but then there's not much literature on it, and it's just a strange thing, I think.
Yes, it's really rather of a crime. I feel like the sort of way it has gone underground since the 1970s, in particular. It seems like they discovered DMT is produced in the brain in the early 70s, and then right after that, it was like psychedelic science had to go completely underground.
Yeah,
and it's just such a, I don't know. I think it's an anticlimactic sort of like way to approach it.
There was a real, what I call the greatest thing that never happened in psychedelia, was Humphrey Osmond, Aldous Huxley, and a guy called neurophilosopher called Smithies, I believe. They had organized an event called Outsight in the 1950s, and it was almost funded by the Ford Foundation. They were going to invite about 100, 200 of the world's leading intellectuals to come to a center to take mescaline and write about it. Mm-hmm. And the invitees included Jung, Einstein, A.J. Ayer, Graham Greene, H.H. Price, number of leading writers at the time. And they were so close to having that done. But in the end, the Ford Foundation rejected, although they said they, sort of indicated they were going to pay for it. In the end, they didn't. And then instead we waited 10 years for Timothy Leary to make his move, and then with the subsequent sort of criminalization of the whole thing. But what a pity that was, because if that 50s Outside project had taken place, today we would have thought of these experiences, I think, in much more intellectual and academic and serious tones. We wouldn't see psychedelics as mere recreational activity. We'd see it as a much more serious endeavor. But thus is history, and we can't change that. Well, we can't change history, but at least I think now, with this sort of renewed interest in the whole thing, we should treat it more respectfully. And that's part of my mission, I suppose.
The ongoing mission of the psychedelic philosopher, indeed. So you, a little while back, you had mentioned your work with Alfred North Whitehead a little bit. I know that that's somebody you have a lot of experience with. For those of you people who don't know, Alfred North Whitehead was one of the more prolific philosophers of the 20th century. He went on to teach Bertrand Russell, who probably went on to become the most famous philosopher of the 20th century. Alfred North Whitehead is most particularly known for his philosophy towards panpsych panentheism. And for the people who don't know at home, panpsych panentheism is a reference to the nature of reality. Panpsych meaning all is mind, panentheism meaning that God is everything and more. What is it about the nature of the psychedelic experience that you think seems to attract people towards panpsych panentheism?
A number of reasons. So if we take a part of that, definition, panpsychism, the notion that minds exist fundamentally throughout all of nature, from humans to rabbits to insects to plants to molecules, even atoms and the subatomic. Mind in very primitive forms, not consciousness as we have it, but some basic form of sentience. One of the reasons people find that hard to believe, one of many reasons, is that this is a Whiteheadian philosopher called Hartshorne wrote this. He said it's very difficult to imagine what it's like to be, a very primitive organism like an insect or whatever. And as a result of that, he calls it the prosaic fallacy. This fallacy of thinking that your prosaic, your common, everyday, mundane consciousness is what consciousness is in total. Because of that, he thinks people don't accept. That's one of many reasons why people don't accept panpsychism. They simply can't imagine that these primitive entities could have any kind of sentience. But one thing then that psychedelics do is they immediately provide you with completely alien types of sentience. For example, new kinds of emotions, different types of perceptions. Certainly is very common, the sort of distortion of time, seeing time at a much different rate, disjoining time from the sort of spatiotemporal time in our prosaic consciousness. So by offering, this is just one of many reasons, but by offering these kind of non-human, inhuman types of consciousness, it immediately makes, I should say, people a bit more sympathetic to the possibility of other forms of sentience out there. That's one way in which it does it. But the reason this is not why I believe in panpsychism. I believe in it mostly because of logical reasons, but certainly psychedelics help the sympathy to it.
So were psychedelics sort of the catalyst for you with that, or these were notions that you were already kind of on track to, and psychedelics perhaps maybe confirmed that?
I was already on the track to that, actually, funnily enough, through Nietzsche, because Nietzsche's got this concept called the will to power, and in his later notebooks and later publications, he talks about that as a affect form of all force. So all the forces we see, all the energy, matter energy we see around us, has an intrinsic and internal aspect, which for Nietzsche was then the will to power, this sort of desire to advance. It doesn't mean greed necessarily, just desire for development, which is in everything. That's what he speculates. He never finished that theory. He went mad. Everything. Okay. But that then linked to Bergson's notion and Schopenhauer as well. Nietzsche was influenced by Schopenhauer, that the will. Schopenhauer was kind of panpsychist. Karl Popper said Schopenhauer was a Kantian turned panpsychist, because for Schopenhauer as well, its will to live for Schopenhauer was fundamental to everything. Nietzsche advanced it and says will to develop. But anyway, so I was sympathetic to Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, but then I realized the most systematic formulation of that was found in Whitehead, and that's what attracted me to his work. Just such fascinating thoughts, similar to Nietzsche in the sense that it just takes you out of your everyday assumptions. It makes you realize they were assumptions, and provides you with these, one of his books was called Adventures of Ideas. Just these incredible speculations, but also systematic reasons for believing it. Mm-hmm. So,
well, reading his work sounds like a psychedelic experience itself, really.
Whitehead, for example, this is very speculative, but he says, we are currently living in the electromagnetic age, one of the fundamental forces of which we are basically. But this is not necessarily the case. This phase will pass, and we'll live in other epochs which don't have that force. We perhaps will. There can exist forms of existence which are not even spatial. He writes, and he writes this in a very reasoned manner, and it's just sort of fascinating to read. And there's another link. And when you have psychedelic experiences, again, another common feature is this sort of destruction, as it were, of space and time. Living in the eternal.
Panentheism.
Related to that, absolutely. So it's just a sort of what in one way. You can interpret it like this. Whitehead provides all these reasons for expanding your intellectual knowledge of reality. And psychedelics provide you with the intuitive sort of realization of that. So they're kind of complementary in that sense.
So one thing that I think about in the midst of hearing you talk about Nietzsche and Schopenhauer is I remember listening to a Terence McKenna lecture one time, and he mentioned something about during their time the sort of states of consciousness that they had available to them were very atypical of Western modalities. And he described people like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche as being on a bad trip, as that being sort of like almost inherent of their, I guess, what we might say, sort of cynical sorts of outlooks on reality. Not that I particularly think that Nietzsche was made the effort at being cynical, but aspects of cynicism do, I feel like, definitely jump out at you. Do you think? What do you think about that? Do you think that's a relatively accurate idea, or do you think it was just a different time?
What do I think, that they are both cynical thinkers? And
The idea that they were on a bad trip, you might say.
Well, I mean, they're both known, stereotypically as sort of pessimistic, nihilistic. But I mean, Schopenhauer was a pessimist. He thought better not to live than to live, because most of life is suffering. Nietzsche, however, called himself an optimist, even though people think he's very negative because he's very critical of Western culture. He himself considered himself an optimist, and he said, we shouldn't devalue suffering like Schopenhauer did. He traces that back to a Christian way of looking at reality, that suffering is bad, that should be avoided at all costs. He thinks there is a lot to be gained through suffering. He famously said, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger." And he also argues, without suffering and pain and obstacles, we would not have evolved into the complex organisms we are today. So suffering is as necessary to reality as pleasure, and there's no inherent betterness of pleasure to pain. So in that sense, he's an optimist, because this is part of his concept, the eternal return, which is this: you've reached psychological peak if you can desire that everything that's ever happened to you will happen again ad infinitum. And that includes all the sufferings of your life. If you can actually want that to happen again and again, forever, then you've reached a point of being able to accept reality, nature, as it is, not as you want it to be, completely pleasurable, joyous, and whatever, but as it is. And that is really ultimate optimism. So, but his ultimate optimism, of course, stems from severe critique of Western culture, which, especially in his time, 100 years ago or more, was drenched in Christianity. And the value of Nietzsche's work really is this: to sort of point out how Christianity is so ingrained within our culture that its assumptions about how to live and what is valuable and what is not valuable is taken as default, is taken as standard, is pure assumption. But if you look at it historically, if you look at the Roman values, for example, these is very different. And his hope, in a way, for the future is to not to return to these old Roman values or master morals, as he calls them, but to at least be able to see, at least to be able to sort of evoke new perspectives, which don't necessarily lead to pessimism.
Right. The idea, the whole God is dead philosophy, it wasn't supposed to be pessimistic in its approach.
No.
It's supposed to be liberatory.
Only pessimistic if you're a Christian, but if God is dead, what it really means is very emancipating, because what it really means is this: if you don't believe in God, in the Judeo-Christian God, I should say, not Spinoza's God or Whitehead's God, but in this traditional form of God, if you don't believe in God, the Christian God, then you've got no right to Christian morality. And by Christian morality, as I said, he includes what are ostensibly atheist moralities, like utilitarianism, deontology, and so on. But anyway, what that does is it sort of frees you into being able to create your own values. And and that's why and also it frees you from any intellectual guilt or remorse you might have had. So in that sense, it's very emancipating, very optimistic, and that's the way I look at it.
The entire 4 books of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, I remember as being very liberatory in its usage of words. The whole most of the pessimistic aspects of Nietzsche's philosophy I felt were almost entirely vacant in the sort of poetry that kind of leaps out at you in Zarathustra.
Yeah, no. And I mean, you have to bear in mind as well that when he wrote that towards the end of his life, he was very sick. You know, he was virtually blind. He suffered from the horrible nausea, severe migraines, for which he took a lot of drugs, which created interesting experiences for him, as I wrote in my book.
Yeah.
And he self-prescribed his own drugs because he was a doctor. He was a doctor of philology, but the pharmacist never asked him about that. You know, so he could get anything he wanted at the time, and he did. But yeah, as a sick man, he was. You know, it's quite interesting because he was actually talking about how to accept reality in all its suffering, even though he was constantly suffering. Maybe this is the way he could overcome it himself. You know, by saying, actually, what I'm suffering here is not bad at all. In fact, it's very valuable. But there's still a lot to be taken from Nietzsche, and I'm very much interested in the link between Nietzsche and Whitehead. I mean, Whitehead actually had a copy of Nietzsche's posthumous book called The Will to Power, and he made marks on it, and I've got a copy of that. It's on.
I think I actually saw you post that on Facebook.
Yeah.
Say that again, sorry.
I think I actually saw you post that on Facebook. The marks that he made in it.
Yeah, so I've posted that, and with a little introduction of its context, but yeah. So this is another avenue to pursue. You know, Whitehead, Nietzsche, also linking Spinoza in there, and then ultimately to incorporate psychedelic experience within all of it.
I want to continue on the Nietzsche tip, but just real quick. I remember seeing you say something else on Facebook that somebody, it was your response to somebody's comment about Nietzsche's whole God is dead philosophy. And your response was something along the lines of the Christian God is dead, but the God of Spinoza is eternal. Can you comment on that?
Yeah. Okay. So someone asked me something like, "Do you believe in God or something?" I can't remember. Is God dead or something like that? And that was asked to me when I was writing about Davian Spinoza, and what it means is this: most thoughtful people don't believe in the Christian God anymore, at least not in the medieval sense, in the original sense, as a man, as something analogous to a man, or the Almighty and whatnot. And this is what Nietzsche talks about. There's no lawgiver. If there's no lawgiver, there are no laws, absolute laws. And this then triggers his whole kind of what's known as active nihilism. I completely accept that. Spinoza wrote about God, believes in God, but his definition of God, I mean, he was accused of being an atheist for hundreds of years, and still is today. The reason is he calls, in his system, which is basically this, there's only, as opposed to Descartes, who had 3 main substances, body, mind, and God. For Spinoza, there was just one substance. And that one substance, which is a fundamental element of reality, he calls God, but he also calls it nature, and he also calls it substance. So in this sense, he's a pantheist. God is everything. But in another sense, people said, well, if you're saying that God doesn't exist in this transcendental, biblical sense, but is only nature, then really you're an atheist because you don't believe in God, because that's what we mean by the word God, it's transcendental figure. Well, he got into a lot of trouble for that, Spinoza. I mean, he was excommunicated. He was Jewish, but living in Holland, and he got excommunicated by the Jewish community when he was only 23, and then he got banned by the Christians. which was basically the state, and ridiculed. But people were always interested in his work. Einstein said, "I'm a believer in Spinoza's God," and even wrote a poem about Spinoza. Einstein did. But so there's one substance for Spinoza, and it has an infinitude of what he calls attributes. We have access to two of these attributes: mind and matter, or thought and extension. And now, when I say I am sympathetic to that, because what it really means is that mind and matter are the same thing, seen from, perceived from different angles, as it were. It's like a double aspect theory, it's known as. So the brain is the mind is the brain, but they're not identical in terms of being physical, because mind and physicality are equally fundamental. But nonetheless, they are different perspectives, different windows upon what is one and the same thing. So I'm quite, I think this is very parsimonious, logical point of view. And so when I say that the God of Spinoza will live forever, what I mean is this, that Spinoza's God is eternal. He never came into being and will never go out of being. In other words, nature will never cease to exist and never started to exist either, contra Big Bang theories and whatnot. So, so that's what I mean when I say God is dead, but Spinoza's God will live forever. So by which I simply mean I reject the Judeo-Christian Islamic notion of God, but I accept nature in Spinoza's sense.
So many more questions I like to ask about that, but to continue on, getting back to Nietzsche, one of your most popular videos, as I recall, on YouTube right now on your Ontologistics page, is a reading of you doing a reading of Nietzsche, particularly with reference to his philosophy of the Overman, the Übermensch, if I'm pronouncing it right. So I was curious as to what your thoughts on the relevance of psychedelics towards the realization of the Overman are.
Well, okay, so what is the Übermensch? It's actually quite a vague concept in Nietzsche's work, even though he's quite well known for it. It's also translated as Superman or the overhuman, superhuman, what will you? But what it means is, in Zarathustra, for example, he talks about, says something like, God is dead, long live the Overman. So in a sense, the Overman is his new ideal, which replaces God. Instead of striving for godliness, as was done before, now we look to the future and we strive for this concept of the development of mankind. Now, I should say at the start here, there are many, many different interpretations of what Nietzsche meant by this. And the reason is because, as I said, he was vague about it. And in a way,
on purpose, right? So it's not like no set image, but just like this constant evolution.
Yeah, exactly. No, I mean, on purpose, probably, so that, he doesn't limit the concept. So, it can evolve of itself. I mean, the reason I made that video was because, for example, he writes in his published works, there has never been an Overman. And a number of people think, well, we can all develop into the Overman ourselves if we overcome our inhibitions and whatever. That's total rubbish. In other tracks, he talks about the Overman as a new species. In another book, he said man is the final species. So, contradictory words. But anyway, the way I like to read it, and like I say, there's no absolute meaning to it. And even if there were, people shouldn't get too hung up on that. You shouldn't just say, well, this is what a philosopher meant, and that's what we have to stick to. No, you take the valuable from a philosopher and you develop it yourself. So I like to think of it as the evolution of mankind into following his notion of world power, more powerful forms, but also that includes them more. By power, what is power? Power is, it's got bad connotations, and that's why Nietzsche used it, Macht. But what it really means is kind of control over your environment. So simpler organisms have less control than we, because we have, you know, 5 traditional senses, for example, where we can perceive, you know, stars millions of light years away. But the overman then, with regard to psychedelics, one of the first English commentators on Nietzsche was a fellow called A.R. Orage. He wrote a book on Nietzsche. He wrote a book on cosmic consciousness, and he made the link already. You know, he said the next step in the evolution of man would have to include new forms, new varieties of consciousness. And this is where we can bring in psychedelics then, because, okay, there's microdosing and nootropics. That's the basic form of it. But one thing that psychedelics do is that they allow people to perceive more of reality than what is there. In other words, we can distinguish, in certain cases, I mean, the psychedelic experience is variegated. I mean, there's so many different forms, but one form of it is this. We have better perception of reality. We can distinguish more colors and sounds. We can slow down time to notice more differences. We can make conceptual links that would never be made in prosaic consciousness. This is why people say psychedelics are so catalytic to creative thought. So in order to, plus, of course, you know, with eyes closed especially, we can experience the most beautiful spacescapes and, as I said before, alien feelings and whatnot. We expand the richness of the human condition. That's why I say people who haven't taken psychedelics, they're really missing out on a fundamental aspect of what a person can be. I mean, it's like living your life without music or good food or whatever. But it's more than that. So one step of the Übermensch, following Orage's line at least, is to say that, well, psychedelics can provide you with these new, this heightened, it's more powerful form of consciousness. And certainly we can see how Übermensch fits into that picture. And that's, I mean, I've always wanted to write an article about this, but I just haven't had time. I've had to write other things and whatever. But eventually that will be a new project, the sort of the intersection of psychedelics and the Übermensch.
One of the things that sort of leaps out to me about it is the whole state of considering yourself free. You know, one cannot assert their will to power, right, unless they're free. And you know, like what consists of what consists of freedom, right? And so, you know, in psychedelics, I feel like particularly like their potential for the healing of addiction, you know, their capacity for you to remove things from your life that are excessive, extracurricular, things that are not needed, you know, things such as the Christian God even. I feel like it has
absolutely, that's another aspect, and I should say that in that sense, Nietzsche and psychedelics are similar in the respect that they take you away from your society, your cultural norms, and whatever. They make your life, your culture from a completely new standpoint, and in that sense, they are both very similar. Whitehead as well. Certainly, I mean, it's quite interesting as well. A number of people say that you know, taking psychedelics make you more moral and whatever. But when you take into consideration Nietzsche's criticism of Western morality, you sort of go beyond that even, because Octavio Paz wrote about this, for example, the Nobel laureate. What psychedelics do is, yeah, they take you away from your assumptions, your personal assumptions, your cultural assumptions. In that sense, they're certainly freeing, they're emancipatory. And they also take you away from these, you know, traditional moral assumptions that you have. And so this is another sense in which one can link the Übermensch to Nietzsche, you know. By the use of psychedelics, one suddenly acquires an intuition of the criticism that Nietzsche gives of Western morality. Perhaps, as I wrote in my essay, Antichrist Psychonaut, which is in my book, this is a related theme. I mean, Nietzsche starts his works in The Birth of Tragedy with the god Dionysus, who's the god of intoxication, and he ends his career by writing about Dionysus. In fact, he even signed off letters as he himself being
Dionysus, right?
Okay, then he dropped into madness. But he also wrote in his autobiography, Ecce Homo, that he was hearing, he was inspired. He heard voices, sort of auditory inspirations from demons and whatnot, muses. So, absolutely, psychedelics can provide this complete new step in a person's life away from the life we lead, away from the society we lead, to a completely new, different mode on reality. So the combination of Nietzsche and psychedelics, I think, can lead to a completely new mode of life, and perhaps even eventually a new mode of human being. And this is related to possibly something called transhumanism and posthumanism, which is actually
that segues me into my next question. Yeah. So yes, transhumanism is probably the most. I don't know. It's definitely a place where philosophy and science are kind of like making the rubber meet the road right about now, and transhumanism, for the people who don't know what transhumanism is sort of a way that we are trying to introduce technology into the physical body as well as our experience of consciousness in order to become more than human. And Pierre Teilhard de Chardin has a lot of really good work along those lines. What are your particular thoughts on the evolution of the Übermensch and transhumanism?
Well, I mean, it's not really my field, but I know this. Nietzsche was certainly one of the figureheads for the whole transhumanist movement. That's been admitted, proved. It was doubted at one point, but certainly he's a figurehead. So the whole transhumanism, Übermensch thing is related. Of course, some people are wary of it because it does have links. It could easily slip into eugenics and the sort of the kind of fascist interpretation of Nietzsche, which is sort of the sort of sterilization of inferior people and whatnot. So you have to be careful with it. But well, my take is, as I say, I don't write about this. I'm more a philosopher of mind, but they're related, and I would like to see a new subclass of that called psychedelic transhumanism. I'd like to see. I mean, that could involve then metaphysicians, philosophers of mind, but also neuroscientists and whatever, to see how perhaps we can make certain psychedelic, what should I say, modes become more permanent somehow. Perhaps we can. I mean, I suppose you can do that through holotropic breathwork to a certain extent, but perhaps there's technologies that can immediately induce, for example, an increased consciousness of your surroundings. Based initially on how psychedelics work, but then made into some form of technology. But like I say, it's not really my field, and I know a lot of it's based on just implanting, sort of implanting machines into your arm to become stronger and whatnot. I think that's just a very primitive form of it. I think what's really interesting is how we can advance our consciousness, how we can perceive more of reality around us, but also how we can conceive reality around us. So a lot of transhumanist thinking has a physicalist basis, a materialist basis. But I think that one thing psychedelics do, as we mentioned at the start, is that sort of the intuition, at least, is very anti-materialistic. And through reason as well, we can see that these physicalist world conceptions just are not consistent. They don't work out, logically. So what does that mean? Well, it means that we have to incorporate mind in our whole conception of reality itself, and thus the human himself. We shouldn't just think we can make physical alterations to change things.
I recall reading about Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, and he, in like the 19 teens, back in like World War I, he's having this vision of the emergence of humanity as sort of a singular being, and are stretching out into the cosmos as that. And I think one of the things that particularly attract me to transhumanism is the idea of the internet, for example. The internet is an expression of a very early sort of unified mind. And as time goes on, I definitely feel like not even so much that it's something that should happen, but it's something that I feel is destined to happen. Our relationship with technology becoming closer and closer to the point of becoming endogenous, to the point of becoming something that is a part of us. And, I feel like whenever this happens, then the whole idea of us becoming like the substances of the gods, I feel like is very tangible.
What that makes me think of is you've heard the term cosmic consciousness.
Yes.
What it means is, a feeling of oneness with reality, a bit like Spinoza's intellectual love of God, as he calls it. But here's the interesting thing with regard to that, to what we've been saying. I was recently reading the book Cosmic Consciousness by R.M. Buck. It was written in 1902, and in it there's a chapter on Spinoza, as it happens. But do you know that in that book of 1902, he uses the word transhuman? So at the start of that concept, which became big in the 60s, at the start of that, we already had the link to the evolution of humanity and literally transhumanism. So again, it's like like psychedelics and idealism or metaphysics. There's an idea at the beginning which then gets lost in later literature, but something to which we can return. But interestingly, in transhumanist conferences at the moment, there's very not much, almost nothing, I believe, on psychedelics in relation to transhumanism, although there's quite a lot of nootropics, smart drugs, and thus microdosing. I mean, that's an immediate connection one can make to transhumanism, microdosing in relation to becoming more efficient at one's work.
Microdosing is huge in Silicon Valley.
Right. Well, I'm, Torsten Passy, Professor Torsten Passy's got a new book coming out on it soon, which I'm helping him with slightly. Which is slightly critical of it, I believe, although I haven't read it yet. But anyway, that's the basic form. But at the start of transhumanism comes the whole notion of cosmic consciousness. So they're fundamentally related. But Arenbeck was a psychologist, he wasn't a metaphysician, and so again, there's just the future holds so much to explore. You have to sort of spend a lot of time thinking about these things and experimenting with these things in order to be able to produce valuable novel work, because there's so much work on psychedelics which just comes out with the same stuff all the time, which is strange because there's so much so much novel stuff to extract from it. But there are people doing the work, and as we're in the so-called psychedelic renaissance at the moment, which has started off as a sort of therapeutic thing, but I'm sure, I see, more and more philosophers get involved with this, and so I'm sure the future will be fascinating, really fascinating.
One of the main things that leap out at me in this whole process is the idea that whenever consciousness and technology do merge, then I hear in a bunch of circles talk of, we need to have a revolution in consciousness. like what does having a revolution in consciousness like typically really even mean? That can mean any number of things to any number of people. But
the word consciousness can mean a number of things to a different number of people as well, in itself. So
yeah, and so as technology becomes introduced into our experience of consciousness, it will redefine our entire experience of consciousness. And that is the essence, I feel like, of a revolution in consciousness. And especially with the evolution towards a unified, like, singular mind, I find the two to be particularly relevant.
Well, time will tell. And also the question emerges as to whether we really want that unified mind to happen. What's the value in it? Things I have not thought about really, but again, more to uncover in the future.
Indeed.
So Peter, thank you so much for joining us. Where can people find your work online?
Well, my website is www.philosopher.eu. I'm on Twitter. Peter.
How did you snag that one?
I don't know. It's strange. I've also got an amazing phone number by pure chance, but I won't give it to you.
No.
Twitter is Peter Sherstead H. I've got a philosophy Facebook page called Ontologistics. You can get my book Numernautics on Amazon and elsewhere. My email is peter@philosopher.eu if anyone wants to email me.
Also, your YouTube page, Ontologistics.
Oh, yes. Right, yeah. Right. As we spoke about that. Ontologistics, YouTube, yeah, that's right. The most popular video there is The Will to Power, Nietzsche. But the one you mentioned, The Overman, is crawling up the ratings as well now.
That's about all the time we have for today on the Psychedelic Spirituality podcast. As always, you can find us on our Facebook page, Psychedelic Spirituality, or at our website, psychedelicspirituality.org.